everyone. Thanks for going your lunch or delaying it at least. This is React overview. So I've been told that some of you guys are going to start working in React. Does anybody currently write any React in their job or hobby or anything? Some, a little bit, just a little bit. One hand up. Okay, that's cool. So I have a friend. Okay, anyways, about me, I'm Misho, Mihail Mikov, whatever. I work at Skyscanner. I'm a senior full stack engineer, whatever that is. And I teach at the American University part-time, do some courses. This semester I'm doing a course on React and Express and other stuff. And I've been using React for a while now. So Skyscanner is founded in 2003. It's a very nice travel search engine. We have a lot of offices, a lot of peoples like from all over the world. And the best part about it is like we're like from 1,000 people, over 50% are engineers. Like that's the best and worst part because too much is happening at the same time. So today I'm going to just very briefly outline something about atomic design. We're going to look at the basics of React. We're going to look at all the possible patterns and use cases. And then, I'm going to just quickly show you how to get a project started. Okay, so what's atomic design? The idea is atomic design is a methodology for creating design systems. So thinking about your system as a system. Right? Instead of ad hoc collection of just web pages that just floating around, and it entails an equal partnership between design and engineering. So there is this in a lot of organizations. There's this strong divide, like cardboard wall, if you permit me, between design and engineering. And React kind of wants to crush that down and help them work together instead of against each other. The ideas, the concepts in atomic design are that you build stuff like nature builds stuff, right? So we have some tokens, like these are just things that, the basic values like colors, widths and stuff like that. And you have atoms, and atoms use the tokens. So an atom is, let's say, a button. Then you have a molecule. Let's say a date picker is a molecule. It's composed of several atoms. It has an input atom, some other things, and a button, let's say, or something like that. And then you have organisms, and organisms are built out of molecules. And an organism is like a whole search control. It has the autosuggest in it, it has a lot of molecules in it, and can have some complex behavior and has an interface to the outside world. And then a system is just a collection of the organisms. And the idea is that it's fractal, it's hierarchical, and it allows for you to encapsulate stuff. So the principles and the benefits at the same time of atomic design are composability, so you can reuse your atoms, molecules, and organisms in very different ways in many different places. And consistency, so once you define your button atom, you can use that button across the site and it will look and work the same way, whatever you put it. And maintainability, so now if you need to change something in your design, you just change that atom and it is reflected everywhere within your source code, so you don't have to go and fix every page independently. And fortunately enough, React helps you follow atomic design. Well, now every modern framework like Angular and Vue and all this stuff, they all now have kind of the same philosophy behind it. So they've unified in a certain way, they've converged to this design philosophy. So what is React? Well, React is just another UI library. And it has some niceties such as a declarative syntax. So you remember PHP maybe, or I hope you don't. So there you could put like code into the HTML or HTML in your code. React does that for JavaScript. And we thought that's awful for HTML. Now we kind of think it's okay for JavaScript, I don't know. But it does that. It prefers like a functional style over any other style. What's another style? Like object-oriented, whatever that is. like classic. It has a virtual DOM, which all of them have now, and it kind of has this philosophy of one-way data flow, and we'll talk about that a lot. So this is, and oh yeah, there's a lot of code in this. So this is how it all starts. You have a function, and a function is a component in React. And this function has to return a element. So we basically have a function. It takes a single argument called props. That's the way you usually call it. Of course, in JavaScript, you can call it whatever you want, but it's usually called props. And then you just return an element. So you say React create element. We are creating a div. We are not giving it any props. And this is the children of that element. So here we are using string inflation. And our application is just another function, which is just another component, which we say react.createElement, and then inside of that we create, as a child of that element, we create our hello component from here, our hello function. We use it as an element instead of a div, let's say, and then we pass in the props, name everyone. Well, writing this looks awful, right? So that's why we have like JSX. This is the HTML-y thing that I've talked about. So, sorry. So here we again, when we import React, and then we say another function. This is just another way to write functions, obviously. So we say hello, which is a function, takes a props with the first argument of stranger, name is stranger. So there's a div now, which is inside the JavaScript, and that's transpiled through Webpack, or your transpiler of choice. I mean Babel through Webpack, or your transpiler of choice in Bundler. And here we just say hello, and then this expression interpolation again, just props.name. So now we can build our hello world component, which is just hello with the name set to world, right? So that's reusing the hello component in the hello world component, and then a page is just, let's say, says hello world, and then says hello to everyone, right? So, that's the basics of it. But sometimes, here, there is nothing changes, right? In this simple page that we've created here, there's nothing going on, right? It just renders that one time and it's done, and nothing else happens, right? So if we need some changes to happen, which is usually why we are hired, then we must write some more code. So here we are using a class component, and by the end of this I'll show you hooks, which is a new thing in React, which makes classes obsolete, finally. Classes were one of the bad parts of JavaScript, like added late for some reason to appease Java programmers, make them feel less angsty. And so here we have a state. This is just a shorthand for assigning some properties to this. So it's like constructor, and in the constructor we say this.state equals the same thing. This is just a shorthand. We define a method here, and we define another method called render. And in this render method, again, we can use the props, and in a class component, props are attached to the instance as well. So you get this props title, and then we can have an input, and here on change, whenever the value of the input changes, we invoke our function here. And also we pass the value in from this state instead of this props. So now we have two things. We have props, which are immutable, so nothing can change the props. You are forbidden and unable, actually. React will throw an exception if you try and change the props, but you can change the state. And you change the state using the function called thisSetState. So whenever you want to edit this input, it doesn't actually, if you don't put that onChange property here, you would have an input on your page, but you cannot type in anything. You would start typing and nothing would appear, right? So, that's kind of the first what the fuck that people encounter when they're dealing with React. They're like, I have an input and it's not updating. Why is that? Well, you need to manually wire the updating. So it's very explicit. And here, we just say, well, extract input from the event, because you have to go event.target.whatever, just imagine I've done that. And then we say set state, and we pass in that input in an object. And then every time we press a button, that would trigger the set state function, and that would set the state and force the component to be re-rendered in the next rendering cycle. So yeah, that's kind of the basics of it. Component lifecycle, so you can do stuff during the component's life cycles. I'll show you a picture about that in a second. Just let's see the syntax first. So here we have a list with data, and we want to say once this component is mounted, so it's created for the first time on the page, we want to trigger fetching some data for that component, and then we want to use that data later on in our render. So here we do here is the constructor. Again, instead of doing this thing here, I've done the more verbose thing. It's kind of the same. And then I'm using this component did mount method, which is basically saying once the component is mounted on the page, so it's created and it's rendered after the first render, use fetch, which is like, I hope you all know what fetch is. It just makes HTTP requests, and we get some data, it returns a promise, we get the data out of that promise, and with the data we call set state, passing the data as the items that would be accessible in this state.items. So now this is basically the idea behind React. So it's very declarative. And as far as I know, because I have very little experience with Angular, Angular kind of does this almost the same thing now, but it uses HTML templates and some wonky ng, attributes, which are a little bit weird to me. But yeah, so this is probably weird to you now, so that's okay. That's okay. We agree to disagree. Okay, so before we move on here, I just need to go and look up a picture because I didn't get time to update that. So this is just almost the same, but with some, nope, that's not what I was looking for. Okay, again. So yeah, that's me. I'm the Bell at GitHub. If you want, you can find me. So frameworks, React, and then there's blah, 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 blah. Oh, yeah, this is the picture I was looking for. Okay, so here, that's the component lifecycle. We'll go back to the previous presentation. So this is kind of a representation of the component lifecycle in a diagram. So whenever we're doing something with a component, React takes care of that component's lifecycle. So we're declaring how the component should look and what the component should do in a reactive way, and then the library itself takes care of of all the internals and when should it re-render, does it have to re-render, and all that stuff. So here we have initialization at the beginning. There is a component will mount thing that is called, which is now kind of defunct. Then render is called. Then component did mount is called. And during updating, there are some other lifecycle events. We're not going to go too deep into this because that would take probably a couple of hours itself. So, but the idea is that there are different flows and different hooks or places where you can hook into to get some stuff done when the library is doing work for you. So let's say the component is gonna should component update is a pretty nice one. It basically allows you to tell React that the component does not need to be updated. So React is gonna check, hey, I'm getting some new props for this component. Should I update? And then you can say, well, even though you've gotten some new props, I know that this doesn't need to update right now. So you can be more efficient and optimize. Then render is called again, and then component did update, which is kind of a counterpart to component did mount. And then, of course, you have component will unmount, where you can clean up stuff that you've set up. So if you've used, like, let's say an observable, or you've subscribed to something, and you want to free it, or like just release that resource, or delete some data at the end, you should do that here in component with unmount. Okay, so continuing from here, there's been like 16 versions of React now, so it's a lot of iteration in the final version. I mean, it's not final, of course. They're going to release React 17, I guess, sometime this year. But a couple of things that are newer in the framework. And here we'll talk about a little bit of fragments and all that stuff, and I'll talk about hooks at the end. Okay, so previously we were unable to render strings directly. You had to wrap them in, some HTML element. Now you can just do, a component can be as simple as returning just a string or returning a number that will get converted to a string. And you can do also this, you can use string interpolation as well, directly as components, which is just a nice thing. Fragments are a way to render things that do not have a container. So each time you're rendering something, you have to render it within a container. You cannot just return, list items, just a couple of them. You have to wrap them in something. And if you don't want to wrap them in any particular type of element, you can just use React.fragment, which is a non-element element. So that's not going to create a DOM element, that's just going to create a node in the virtual DOM, right? Okay, so that's it, and now you can kind of do this here thing, and the idea behind this is it kind of helps with the single responsibility principle. So if you have, let's say, some important content that you need to render in different contexts, and this model container or a side container here, they would provide different styling and different, basically different styling for your important content. So you don't have to make two versions of that content and, say, I've updated the content, and then the client calls you and, well, it's not updating for me, and then you forget that you get it in two places. So kind of helps with that a little bit. And you can have something like this, where you assemble a feed of items using fragments. So let's say you have some container for your feed, and then you can set like some alerts, which you pass a stick to top kind of property or prop here, and then you can say take 5 stories from my family feed, take 5 from my friend's feed, and fill up the rest with some news. And I hope that this kind of exemplifies why using React can become very productive and very nice, because it allows you to express your application views in a very, very declarative way. There's a lot of logic probably hidden behind this, but you don't see it from 1,000 feet. You just see exactly what you need to see. You see what the application is doing. Okay. So this is, again, some niceties and improvements that came kind of late, that should have been there previously. But, a bug fix later is better than a bug fix never, so yes. Okay, so when you call setState previously, before React 16, you didn't have a way to say, oh, I'm calling this setState, but I didn't actually change it, right? So now, and this is, obviously, you can wrap your, this setState call in an if and do the check outside, but for some reason they've added it inside. So now you can just say, well, if the, and also, previously we've seen that we pass a object to setState, but we can also pass a function. And if we pass a function, that function receives our previous state and our new props. So we can say, well, if the props changed and the selected thing that the parent component passed in is different than the selected thing that we have in our state, then we can just say, if it's the same, we say nothing changed, so don't need to re-render anything, right? But if it's changed, then we can return this object where the selected thing is the new selected thing from the props. Okay, we have now error boundaries in React. This is a way for us to say that some component will be able to handle errors in its subtree. So let's say you have a couple of subtrees of components. So you have your main content and you have some ads on the side. If there is some exception that the ads components generate, you don't want that to stop your main content from rendering, right? So that gives you a way to prevent the whole page from crashing. So you say, we define our component, cleverly called capturing the RAI, and then it's just a component. It has some state, so we track whether we have an error or not. And whenever this component catches an error, we can trigger a set state where then we say, well, if we have an error, we can print some error message. If we don't have an error, just print, just return the children that were originally passed to that component. So this props children is where React keeps everything that's inside. So we see here, this is a container or just some component. And inside we have some other components like HTML children. It's the same idea. We can use props.children to access these. Okay, so some new lifecycle methods. That diagram that I showed previously, yeah, this is the better one. Yeah, we had it, I don't know. Okay, so some new lifecycle methods got defined. Sorry. We have get derived state from props. This takes the props and the state, and you can, basically the idea is sometimes the state of the component, so the internal state that the component keeps, is dependent upon the things that the parent component passes in. Let's say we have which line we are on, like which line is highlighted versus which page we are on. Once the page changes, the highlighted line doesn't make sense anymore because we are on a new page. So we have to recalculate the state based on the props. And this is a convenient place to do it. Get the right state from props. Get snapshot before update. This is weird. This is just so you can, because React, okay, let's go to the to this diagram. So here, a better diagram from what we saw previously. Again, we have like the mounting, the updating, and the unmounting paths. When we mount, we call the constructor. We then call get derived state from props, and then we call render, and then React updates the DOM in a separate phase. So React breaks up the calling of your component functions. So whenever React calls your render method, nothing actually happens. The only thing that happens is that you've created a virtual DOM node, right? So you've populated your virtual DOM, but you haven't changed the DOM itself, right? The actual DOM. So that happens in this phase here, in the commit phase. And in the pre-commit phase, React, in this get snapshot before update, React allows you to capture some state from the actual DOM. So you say you've been scrolling and you want to capture your scroll position. This is the right place to do that. You want to capture something from the original DOM and later reuse it in your component. And then again, we have component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. That's basically it. Okay, a couple words about context. So what's context? The idea here, let me see, did I do it right? Okay, yeah. So let's just look at the use case first. Let's say we have a site that has a header, some content, and a footer, and we want to apply a theme to all the elements of our site, right? So we want to have a theme, let's say light versus dark. And here we can do that using a context. And if we follow the props mechanism, we have to pass the theme all the way down. So starting from the top level or some level, any component that would require the theme needs to get that theme by being passed the prop that says, like, theme name light or dark, needs to get passed all the way down the component hierarchy. But using a context, we can avoid that. We just define a theme context, calling this React theme context thing, and then in our application, we say theme context.provider. We can have a bunch of those, so we can have different values for the same context within our application, but sometimes we just need one, like in this example. So we have a provider component, and that would kind of pass, that would allow for children components to query the value of that context whenever they need it. So here in our header component, even though we don't pass any props to it, in our header component we say theme context.consumer, and then we get the theme inside a, this is called a render prop component. Not component, but let's call it a, what is it? A pattern. Yeah, it's a pattern. Yeah, so in this pattern, the idea is that instead of passing elements to the, as a child to something, we can pass a function, right? And then we can have some, you know, outside help in that function, as, you know, the arguments of that function are injected from somewhere, and then we get that, we can say logo and class name, and then we say light or dark logo, basically, based on the theme. Does that make sense? Am I going too fast? Maybe.
It's okay, just where this theme property came from?
Yeah, it comes from here. So it doesn't matter how much separated.
No, I mean, it's just like a property. I don't see it anywhere.
Yes. Yeah, it's, well, you can, the names of the arguments in your functions can be anything, right? So I could call it grandma, okay. And it's, you know, but this, because I'm using the theme context, it's gonna basically walk up the tree of components, find the first instance of a provider, and read the value from there, and, you know, pass it in as the argument of that function. Okay. That's the idea. Okay. So I don't need to pass the value light to every component down the tree. I can just pass it to a provider, and then whichever component needs it down the tree just looks it up from that provider.
And can you have multiple contexts?
Oh yeah, yeah. You can have multiple contexts, and using hooks, which I'll show in a bit, makes that much easier. Okay, so here I was showing a little bit of what we can do with the dynamic context. So here the value of this context is static, right? We cannot change it, right? But usually if we have a theme, we want to allow the user to pick which one they like more instead of us choosing for them. So here we can have a dynamic context, and literally basically saying initially the theme is dark, but then we have a theme toggle, and we have some preview, and then in the theme toggle we can say you use set data. This is not a thing that's actually in the framework. It's a component that you can implement itself in a couple of lines of code, and this is how you do it. So this is how you use it basically, and this is very clunky right now. This looks very clunky, but with hooks it becomes very easy to use and to understand. So let's go over it again. This part is kind of obvious, but let's look at that. So we have the consumer, and in the consumer we receive two arguments. We receive data, and we get the theme out of it, and we have set data. And now we can have a button that when it's clicked, we can say change the theme, right? So it's a toggle. Right? So we say from light to dark. This other function here is just, you know, imagine it like, you know, if it's dark, then return light. If it's light, return dark. That's it. So this allows us to call set data, and under the hood, all we are doing is that our component, our provider component, has some state, and we are using set state internally. We are renaming that as set data for some reason here. And then I'm just checking if the theme is the same, then don't do anything. If the theme is different, then merge the data and return an object. I mean, set the state to the new data and pass itself, like set data, as part of the context. And now the idea is that we have that context, we use the state as the value for the context. It's a little bit complicated when you see it for the first time, but it's actually pretty easy to use. So here the idea is that we're using the state of a component as the value for some context, and that allows us to, to have state that we can change from anywhere within that component subtree. So here we have that context provider and we have toggle and preview. Both toggle and preview can consume that context, and both of them can also change that context now, change that context value. Okay, well, refs is a way for us to access the actual DOM. So,
Can I ask something?
of course, yeah, sure.
So when it's good to use the context or just to pass the props down the tree? I mean, if it's like two components, should you use context?
Well, it very much depends. I mean, it depends on the particular application. If a component does not need to know about something, it's better for it not to know, right? So, and if that data that you're passing around makes sense as a thing by itself, you can wrap it in a context, right? That's why we have like a theme context, right? If it was just a general data context, right, that doesn't kind of work that well, because you're now creating too much coupling within the same kind of thing. So it's encouraged that you have multiple contexts, and if you need to use a piece of data within different sections of your subtrees, better have it as a context instead of passing it down. But let's say if it's something that each of the levels of the components should use anyway, then you don't need a context. You can just pass it down the levels. So it's very much dependent on what you're building and what's the logic and what's the best representation in the specific case. There's no like one true answer. But yeah, as much as possible, don't pass props to components that they don't use themselves, right? If you have it, like, even if it's one level deep, right? Doesn't make sense. But if you're just using it for one thing, it's easier to just pass it through than set this all up. So if it's just a one-off thing, maybe it makes sense to just hack it instead of investing in creating a context and then, although it's not that difficult to do. Okay.
Here with the team, it will be actually, it's an example of being used on every level.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. The theme is like a thing that you can use. The language, like, if each component has the locale or, some currency information or geo or whatever, you can, wrap that in context. And in React Native, which is like an implementation of React for mobile development, it actually uses context to wrap around all the, let's say, device level things that you get from the device, like exactly geolocation and all these APIs that the device has can be wrapped in context, and it actually works pretty well because you can just, import them in various places. Okay, refs are a way for us to get to the underlying DOM. So right now we don't have access in React, we don't have direct access to the actual element on the page, right? We are only manipulating our virtual DOM. The benefit of that is that the virtual DOM is very lightweight compared to the original DOM. When you're accessing the DOM in the browser, there's always a marshalling penalty. So you're basically going from your JavaScript thread, which runs in V8 or Chakra or SpiderMonkey. You're making a call into C++ land or Rust land, yay Rust, and then you get that penalty of basically context switching within the other thread. So here we discourage that, so if, as much as possible, don't touch the actual DOM, but sometimes you need to do it. Let's say to focus a component, right? You want to focus on an input once your page loads. We can do that like this. Let's say we create a ref which is just some object that we have, and then we say input when the component mounts, let's say the current value of that ref, and focus, right? And we call the method on that particular DOM element. And here we say the input, we pass in the props, and we can use this like spread for the props. We can use this spread syntax. Basically, whatever properties are, whatever things are in the props, they would be assigned as props of input now. And apart from the props that were passed in, we can also attach the ref to that input. So now the component renders, this input is rendered, and once it's rendered, we can focus it now. So that's the kind of the flow of control here. Forward refs are a thing that allows you to say, my component wants to expose a ref to the outside world. So here we have an input, and an input is an actual HTML element, right? And you can just, physically create one of these in the browser without it. But what if we want to say, I want to have some methods on my React component, like some not declarative but imperative methods on my React component, and for some reason I need those. And how do I make that? How do I make my React component act as if it's a DOM component? And we can do that using a forward ref here. So it exposes the child component's ref as the parent's ref. So in this example here, I'm making some dark slide. I'm using actually the slides for this presentation are written as React code. So this thing actually runs in the browser, right? So you can have anything running in this, any JavaScript running in this presentation. It actually runs pretty well. So here, let's say I want to make a dark slide. For technical reasons, I need to expose the slide ref, even though I'm passing in some extra props. So here again, we're doing the thing where we're getting the props from above, spreading them, but then overriding with some specific values that we want to override for these props. And here, we use that ref. By calling React forward ref, we get the props, we get a ref, and we can assign that to our internal component, and that would make it seem from the outside, from the parent of that component, it would seem as if this dark slide is actually an instance of a slide component, if that makes sense. You can do it for the input as well. You can say forward ref, so we have a focus component, and I want to say whenever in this focus component I am doing something, I want to access it from the outside. So this ref right now is internal. The parent component cannot get the ref for our input, right? In order to do that, we need to use a forward ref to allow the outside world to access our component. Okay, so a little bit about patterns. Sorry, this is a lot. There's just code in this. I don't know how to make presentations without code. So here I'm just going to quickly talk about like the patterns that we have, and then I'm going to switch to another presentation to just show you hooks real fast. Actually, let's do it. Higher order components allow us to do decorations and mix-ins, allow us to do template methods, or apply the strategy pattern, and we can use render props and as a callback pattern. So what does this all mean? Decorating a component, let's say we're extending a component functionality by wrapping it in a higher order component. So here we have a loading button, and I have some button that I already made, and I can say with loading my button, and now we've attached some additional functionality to that button. I can say themed loading button, and I say with theme, loading button, and then it becomes a component that has both the theme and the loading spinner once it's clicked, let's say. Disappearing theme loading button, you see where I'm going with this. So this is a way to just kind of nicely attached functionality to a thing. And a very kind of big use case for this is when you use Redux. If you've ever used it, maybe in Angular they also have Redux, right? I think. So you can say redux.connect, and then you pass in some functions here that kind of map props to state, and then you say you pass in your component. So this Redux connect creates a higher order component. So here you can have like this route thing. Let's say this is a router where you say whenever the path matches, like the URL path matches dashboard, render this particular component. And you can have a bunch of these like in a list, and then React just goes through them, finds the one that matches, and renders the component that's right for that particular path. You can have a list view, let's say, where that list view, let's say, always renders the numbers from 1 to 10. But you want to have some control over how the numbers are rendered. And then you can say, we can make the list view accept a prop that is another component that would be used as the component to render each specific element. Does that make sense? So you're passing in what child components should list view use here. And that's a popular pattern in, let's say, Android, they use the same thing. And here is a very nice one, like a data fetching component. So instead of writing a class where you have component did mount, and then you do fetch, and then you render, you can abstract that away in a data fetcher and say, I want to load this URL. I have a component to show while it's loading, and then I want to display my data in this graph component, right? So an additional property or a prop that we can pass here should be on error, or like an error handler component, where if something goes wrong with the request. But you can imagine that. Render props, we've talked about that a little bit. So here we are kind of bound to use a graph component, that the graph component in this case should know how the data fetcher passes the data in, right? So there is an implicit contract here between the graph component and the data fetcher, because the graph should know which prop the data fetcher is gonna pass the data in, right? What's the name of that prop? If you don't have that, if you don't want to do that implicitly, you can just use a render prop here. So instead of having a component to be displayed, you can pass in a function, and now we can say data. In this case, you know, it makes sense to do it like that, but imagine you can be like, here it can be not data, but you know, a couple of props, and you need to split this data up and pass it in the component as separate things. We've seen the thing happen with React context, and there's also this kind of route where you can use the children instead of passing it in as a prop. So kind of this thing and this thing are completely equivalent in a way. But here, of course, you can have more than one component, right? Here you are kind of forced to have the dashboard represent the whole subtree, while here, while here you can have any subtree you want, and that kind of is more flexible. Lazy loading, well, yeah, you can do this. You can have loadable components and say whenever like I don't want to load a big component thing, like let's say the graphics component that renders like pie charts and whatever, or like some graphics. I don't need that all the time. I only need that when the user clicked this one button. So I can make that component loadable, and it would only load the component whenever I actually render this loadable component, and it's pretty nice. And you can do, of course, some, you know, you can have, say, if the configuration of the application is set to graphs, do a graph view, import the graph view component, or if it's set to tables, you can, you know, import the table view component. right? So you can have some flexibility in which components you're loading. Okay, here, taking this pattern further, we have a loadable component and we can have a component registry. And here, instead of importing a particular file, we can fetch a component from some, advanced server thing that kind of pre-renders your components and does a lot of work for you on the server side. So here you're loading a user profile, and we can also pass in, so this ID here, user7245, is actually the ID is passed to the server. So now the server, you don't know where the user data is. You have no idea. The component registry is returning both the component definition in terms of how the component will look and the user data, right? And it's doing it in one call. So you don't have to load the component first, then wait for the component to load the data and all of that stuff. You can kind of make it like a thing. State management, not going to go into that. This kind of future stuff, let's just do hooks instead because it's, too much. So hooks, again, sorry for not integrating the whole presentations together, but nope, this is not it. So yeah, hooks, yay. But you can see all my presentations are kind of the same. So hooks are all about the evolution of the APIs that React uses. So we know now some of the stuff that React provides as functionalities. So in 2015, if you wanted to use a ref, again, a ref is the access to the actual DOM elements. If you wanted to use a ref, you could do it like this: ref equals search box, and just attach a string here, and then the component magically knew to put that thing as a property of this .refs. So you can do that. This is kind of looks okay, but implementation-wise, it has a lot of weirdness underneath and kind of breaks in a lot of specific situations. So they went away from that. Later we had a callback ref, where instead of passing a string, you can pass a function, and that function you can say assign my ref to this search box, right? So now we manually assign the ref using the function. They've moved away from that as well, made it a little bit more convenient. You just define, like what we saw before, React create ref, and then you say that ref equals this search box ref. Under the hood, this thing actually does exactly the same as this, right? Because when you create an object can be also a function. Okay, but now with hooks, and as you can see, we needed a class. Before 2018, we needed a class to use refs. But since 2018, we no longer need classes to access refs. We can use a functional component, and this is the new thing, React hooks. And all hooks starts with the use keyword, or not keyword, but just use. That's a convention, so we can have linters, enforce some rules on hooks. And the idea here is that you just have your component as a function, and you say my search box refs equals react.useRef. This creates a ref, and then I just pass in that ref the same way I do in this example here. But instead of writing a complete class, I can just do it in a function. So what's this use effect here now? Well, use effect, again, is a way to short circuit the need to write a class which has component date mount, component date of date, and will amount. All of these properties are folded into the use effect hook. So now we can call use effect, and we can set like the title of the window, let's say, or anything that we would have done in lifecycle methods. We can do it in our use effect fallback. So this basically these two examples are completely equivalent. So component did mount, when the component mounts, use the props to set the window title to the username. When it updates, use the props to update the title to the username. When it unmounts, when this component is like destroyed, you know, just make the title, you know, blank or no user selected, something like that. Here we do the same thing. The component did mount and component did update hooks, not hooks but callbacks, are folded within this one line, so you just need to write it once. And then if you return a function from your use effect, that function is going to be used as your component unmount callback, right? So it's a much nicer way or much smaller syntax to do that. And underneath the hood, React actually can do a lot more optimizations with this rather than this. Sorry, just a sec. Okay, so context, again, I didn't even show that before. In 2016, there was legacy context. On each level, you had to define this method, getChildContext, which was awful. Didn't save you anything, actually. Very bad API design for this one. But then they've created the use context, or not the create context thing, where you have the provider and the consumer. We saw that already. Now with hooks, you can say, again, create context, this is the same, but when the provider is also the same, but the usage of the context, instead of doing this thing here, context, consumer, and then pass in a render prop, you can actually say use context, pass in the theme context, and you get that theme property within your function. So it's become from this thing, it goes down to, you know, just one line. Pretty nice. Okay, state, kind of the same idea. We have set state, you know, and we do some stuff here. If the state is seen, then don't return anything. If not, you know, render some warning that we're using cookies and we're collecting your data. And then if we want to do it with hooks, we can just say use state. The default is false. And then the use state function returns to us the state itself, which is like, we call it scene, and a setter for this particular piece of state, which is set scene, right? So instead of calling set state and passing in scene here, we can just get scene, and we can call set scene with true here. So again, these two things are completely equivalent. So that's why kind of hooks, you know, make it an easier API. So kind of, you know, one pattern to rule them all. That's not quite true. There are some things that you can do with hooks, but that's okay. You can use hooks for like a redux. There's a use reducer thing, which basically does what redux does, but we're not going to go into that because it's, you know, too much. The good thing about hooks is that it lets you abstract logic. So when you have, like, let's say, instance methods, right, and you have on mount, on update, and stuff like that, you have logic spread all around the place, and it's much harder to reuse and to update. With hooks, you can just extract some logic into a hook. Let's say here we're using use focus on mount, and we create a ref, we focus it on mount. And here, this thing, passing in an empty array here, tells React only do that once, right? Because if we pass some value here, React would only call the callback when that value changes, right? So if we don't pass anything, it would call it every time. It would call it on every update. But if we pass a value here, any value, it would see, did the value change from the previous time? If not, we're not going to call the callback anymore. If it changed, we're going to call the callback. So if we pass an empty array, that means that we only want to do it the first time and then not do it anymore. So that's kind of a way to say component on mount, right, instead of every time. And here we have a search box and we say use focus on mount. We can also use the theme. You can use a custom theme hook, and then, which is just a context thing. And then we say we attach the ref, and because we are using this custom hook, that ref is going to get focused, right? Which is cool. And we can also use the style. we can use the theme. So instead of writing, you can now imagine and appreciate that if we wrote that as a class, that class would be littered with like, you know, more stuff like in the context, and this would be divided into several different methods. Now it's very easy to encapsulate that logic and reuse it across all of your components. Again, the dynamic context thing, so now we can do that very, very easily, like use context and use state. We combine those and we allow a dynamic context with a couple of lines of code instead of that big monster that we saw before. And this is how it all works, of course. I mean, you just have the virtual DOM and the properties, your state and your refs and all of that is just attached to the virtual DOM. This is a very bad picture, but you know, this is the virtual DOM tree, and you know that if you're in this, you're rendering this component and you want to get some context, if the context provider is on this level, React is going to search for the nearest instance of the context provider and get the value and pass it back to your component. If you're using state, the state is attached into the component, into the virtual DOM. It's hooks all the way down. I've actually raised a bug against the React team for this missing functionality, but it's probably not going to be a hook because of some considerations. Because if you want to have a error boundary, you want some component to catch errors, you want that to be explicit in the tree, right? So you want to say this component is a component that catches errors from its subcomponents. And if you're using a hook, that's hidden inside the component, so it's not visible to the virtual DOM. And that's a bad thing, so they're going to do a different thing. They're going to solve this problem in a different way. Okay, but you can of course do like a render prop version of this, and yeah. Okay, anyway, some major drawbacks. The point with hooks is that you always have to call them. So here in this example, I cannot put the hooks inside an if state, right? Because React does some magic by the ordering of how you call hooks. So that's kind of an implementation drawback of the current implementation of hooks. You always have to call them in the same order. But a positive of that is that your component rendering is very stable. That means that there is no explosion of possible states or possible ways the component is rendered. It's always rendered in the same way, right? So it gives you a little bit of reproducibility yeah. Okay, so that's it. Let's see, do I have a... Yeah, thank you, slide. Yay! Any questions? Because, yeah, let's do that. The others.
No questions.